baby by my heavenly side. I know if I go, I'll die happy tonight.
He said one day you'll leave this world behind, so live a life you will remember.
Welcome to God is Open. I am your host, Christopher Fisher. Today on God is Open, we are going to be covering the book of Ben Sira, the book of Sirach. This is an apocryphal text included in some Old Testament canons, most notably the Catholic canon. And so there's some interesting passages from this book that look like it might support early, perhaps reconceptualization of omniscience, which includes present, past, and future acts. But if we look at the text, as we're going to do so today, it's probably not talking in that fashion. Instead, it's probably representing a prior theological notion. God watches the world, God calculates, God reasons, God's able to predict the future due to his meticulous involvement in the present, his understanding of people's hearts, his watching, and his continual interaction with the world. This book of Ben Sira is all about individual volition. The entire theme of it, the message of it, is that we need to reform our own lives and act better, do better. Reading this, it reminds me of Polonius from Hamlet, where he's got this list of sayings, a lot of Proverbs type claims and sayings we're going to find throughout. And there's going to be plenty of references to Old Testament texts. And so let's start with the preface. And the preface is coming from the Greek translation made in Alexandria, but this is a Greek translation of an older Hebrew text. And you're going to see this older Hebrew text shine through even this Greek translation. But reading this preface, you are urged therefore to read with good will and attention, and to be indulgent in cases where, despite out of diligent labor in translating, we may seem to have rendered some phrases imperfectly. For what was originally expressed in Hebrew does not have exactly the same sense when translated into another language. Not only this work, but even the law itself, the prophecies, and the rest of the books differ not a little as originally expressed. So notice that note about translation. Interestingly enough, we do have some Hebrew versions, partial versions, fragmented versions of Ben Sira, the book of Sirach. We have Hebrew versions, but partials of them. So we're able to cross-compare various notes, various readings, various renditionings of various verses, and they tell us a lot about how the original text is meant to be taken and the potential Greek translations. That's one thing you're going to see in this work, is that the same verse can be translated in several different ways, and they might confirm the priors of, let's say, the translator. The translator could try to make that verse say their specific theology, or he could translate it in a way that doesn't fit certain theological notions. Because language is loose, words have various meanings, the text isn't particularly clear in some cases. So even some verses where I previously thought that they indicated future perfect foreknowledge of all things, when you actually look at it, it doesn't seem to be the case that's what those verses are describing, because of translation variations, because of contextual reasons. We know that that's not the case. So like the Proverbs, the book starts with God's ability to see the world. This is going to be a reoccurring theme throughout the book of Ben Sira, that God watches the world. God sees the world. God's eyes are on the world. God judges the heart. God searches the heart. God renders according to each person what that person does. This idea of a fast judgment is pretty common within this book. The idea that God watches and then decides and reacts all in a timely fashion. This is not the idea that the entire future is all mapped out from all eternity. Although there are some passages about God bringing ancient things to pass and guiding the course of history, we see how he does it. The mechanism is described. It's a continual micromanagement. It's a continual involvement. It's a long-ranging plans that were made previously that he brings to fruition. So reading Sirach 1:2, The sand of the sea, the drops of the rain, and the days of eternity, who can count them? Rhetorically speaking, that's of course talking about God. The height of heaven, the breadth of earth, the abyss, the wisdom, who can search them out? Yes, naturally it's saying not you, not I, it is God. There's a lot of glory to God. There's a lot of praises to God throughout this work. The focus here is on God. And it tells one of the passages say, just praise God continually, because he is unfathomably great. We can't search him out. We can't even sing of all the praises that he's due. He's just beyond that. We just don't have access to all the reasons we need to praise God. So just continually praise God. Give him glory. Give him praise. And God likes that. God receives that from us, and he enjoys that. Within this text, it describes God as wanting our worship, wanting our praise, and responding accordingly. Wisdom was created before all things, and prudent understanding from eternity. So wisdom is also a theme of this book. We need wisdom. We rely on wisdom. God grants wisdom. God gives wisdom. God works with people to implement wisdom. Wisdom's even anthropomorphized in this text in certain places. Not necessarily here, maybe in this passage, it's unclear, but wisdom seems to have some sort of personification like we see in the Proverbs. Wisdom's personified. Again, this work draws heavily on the Proverbs. You'll see a lot of similarities when you are reading through this. Now we're skipping forward to chapter 15, verse 18. For great is the wisdom of the Lord. He is mighty in power and sees everything. His eyes are on those who fear him, and he knows the deeds of man. This idea of eyes reoccurs throughout this as well. God's eyes watch the good, watch the wicked. It's a reference to the Proverbs, where Proverbs 15:3, particularly, God's eyes are in every place, keeping watch on the evil and the good. And this is all in context, of course, of God giving man free will. God has given you free will. You need to choose what is right. God can see you as you're doing those things. So keep that in mind and help that guide your decisions. God will merit out justice as he sees fit in a timely fashion for insubordination, for sin, or even for righteousness. God will hear your prayers. God will respond to your prayers. God is watching. God knows what's going on. Part of the idea of God watching the world is because God can see all the world. God does have the duty to reward each person according to their deeds, to actually bless the righteous and punish the wicked. That's part of his responsibilities using this type of omniscience, this active watching, this active surveillance of the world. Like we see in Ezekiel and other texts, there are quote-unquote practical atheists that are being addressed here. It says, do not say, I shall be hidden from the Lord, and who from on high will remember me? Among so many people I shall not be known, for what is my soul in boundless creation? So over and over we see this idea that the atheist thinks God is not watching. This is the height of atheism. This is the height of rejection of God. God is watching is the response. God will see what you do. God can see through the clouds. God knows what you're doing. And in this book, the atheist, the practical atheist, thinks that darkness will hide their deeds. That is not the case. So let's read this theology of man that is described in chapter 17. The Lord created man out of the earth and turned him back to it again. So he's giving over authority to man. He gave man few days, a limited time, but granted them authority over things on earth. Notice this delegation of authority again. It's not the Calvinist notion of God that hoards all authority and all powers to themselves. It's this idea that man has free will. Man has volition. Again, this is hammered over and over within this text. Man's responsible for what he does because he can do things. He can choose. God's given him this ability. He endowed them with strength like his own and made them in his own image. So look at that. He made them in his own image. What does that mean? That they have strength, that they have authority, that they have volition. He placed fear in them, in all living beings, and granted them dominion over the beasts and the birds. He made them tongue and eyes. He gave them ears and a mind for thinking. He filled them with knowledge and understanding and showed them good and evil. Mankind has knowledge. Mankind has intellect. Mankind has volition. Again, it's a reoccurring theme. He set his eyes upon their hearts to show them the majesty of his works, and they will praise his holy name, to proclaim his grandeur of his works. He bestowed knowledge upon them. Skipping forward, their ways are always before him. Remember, he's always watching them. He's always seeing what they're doing. They will not be hid from his eyes. He appointed a ruler for every nation, but Israel is the Lord's own portion. This is recalling back to the phrase in Deuteronomy where God set up rulers for the different peoples. He put different divine heads over different nations. Israel is the Lord's, but Lord has apportioned other people to other deities. These are subordinate deities. This is the idea being recalled here. So it looks like, they're taking the Dead Sea Scrolls reading of that Deuteronomy passage where God's apportioning the sons of God to rule over the nations of the world. All their works are as the sun before him, and his eyes are continually upon their ways. Their iniquities are not hidden from him, and all their sins are before the Lord. Again, all this, of course, would be irrelevant in Calvinism. God doesn't need to see to know what people are doing. He doesn't need to watch their sins. In this situation, people have volition. He created them like himself. He created man in his image, which includes responsibility, includes volition, the strength to do things, dominion, and people need to use these things wisely or else God will see and God will punish. God has a duty to punish. What's really interesting is that Ben Sira, of course, is coming from an older time. And so in the oldest traditions, what do? We pray upwards. Our prayers ascend to God. God's on his throne. He's surrounded by his minions, his people. The petitions are brought before him. He considers them and he responds to them. And so this idea is carried over in this text. Let's read a couple passages which indicate as such. Sirach 21:5, the prayer of a poor man goes from his lips to the ears of God, and his judgment comes speedily. Again, this idea of God will act quickly in response to things that he hears and he sees. But notice it goes from the man's lips to the ears of God. 16, he whose service is pleasing to the Lord's will be accepted, and his prayer will reach to the clouds. It's this idea of that divine counsel in the clouds. Reading on, the prayer of the humble pierces the clouds, and he will not be counseled until it reaches the Lord. And so the prayer doesn't get reflected by the clouds. It goes through the clouds, gets all the way to God. He will not desist until the Most High visits him and does justice for the righteous and executes judgment. Let's listen to other passages from Sirach. God listens to his people, considers the needs. A petitioner needs to ensure God hears his prayers. 17:25, 34:24, by ensuring one is worthy of being heard. 4:6. So God doesn't respond to everyone's prayers. You need to make yourself right. You need to become righteous. Then you can pray. Then God will listen. Then God will respond. Mankind needs to correct their ways, and this will ensure God's fidelity. In 35:15, God watches the widows. This is interesting because the widow's tears fall from their eyes. And the idea that this is describing here in this verse is that because this widow is crying, that's particularly egregious to God, the violation of these widows. And so he's moved to pity because of their emotional state. And so their emotional state weighs in on God's response, God's pity. It pulls at God's heartstrings, and it affects him in a way that like a normal prayer won't. If you're praying in passion, if you're praying in distress, if you're praying in this emotional state, God is more likely to respond to your prayers and judge more harshly those people who are doing you ill. That's the idea that's being discussed here. We were talking earlier about wisdom being personified. If we turn to chapter 24, it talks about wisdom. Wisdom will praise herself and will glory in the midst of her people. In the assembly of the Most High, this is the divine council, she will open her mouth, and in the presence of his host she will glory. This is interesting. So again, just like the references to the other prayers within this book, the idea is that God sits in heaven, listens to the petitions of his people, and then responds accordingly. This is an ancient idea. This is not a Hellenized book. Scrolling down to chapter 23, we see the atheist again. A man who breaks his marriage vow says to himself, "Who sees me? Darkness surrounds me, and the walls hide me, and no one sees me. Why should I fear?" Again, practical atheism. A very common idea at that time was that God can't see through walls. God can only see what happens in the open air. If there's darkness that conceals someone, God's not going to see those things. This is the unrighteous person speaking, and it's a common thing. Right? The counterclaim is not, oh, God has all access to all propositions, the truth values of all propositions, past, present, and future. The counter is always, God can see you. You're not hiding from anyone. God could see through the darkness. He could see through the walls. You're out of luck, friend. You can't be doing that stuff. His fear is confined to the eyes of men. He does not realize that the eyes of the Lord are 10,000 times brighter than the sun. They look upon all the ways of men and perceive even the hidden places. God has active watching surveillance over the entire earth is the counterclaim. So turning to Raphael Pettazzoni, he talks about various other religions in which omniscience is a factor where other deities watch the world. And this 10,000 to 10,000 times brighter, 10,000 eyes, numbers like that signify this type of omniscience. You're going to find that throughout various religions. The vain fancy of the impious man that he can escape the all-seeing vision of deity is to be found also in Avesta, with references to Mithra, who is a sky and sun god, and also 10,000 eyes of the Iranian Mithra, and the 1,000 eyes of Varuna. Recall the pronouncement of Ben Sira that the eyes of the Lord are 10,000 times brighter than the sun. Over and over again, you see common themes throughout ancient religions. These numbers, 10,000 eyes, vision, 10,000 times brighter, watching the world, a common motif happening again and again. What this should indicate for us, what it should tell us, is they had similar ideas, conceptions of omniscience when they're using this similar language. So now we get to this 23:20. This is an interesting verse because this could be claims of some sort of eternal knowledge of all things within the future. Before the universe was created, it was known to him, so it was after it was finished. Let's look at some alternative translations, and we can see what I'm talking about by why translations matter, because words are flexible. They could mean many things, and we could try to look to see what fits the context most naturally. So, before all things were created, this is the CEB, before all things were created, God knew them so well after they were finished. Okay. G&T, he knew everything before he created the world as well as after. All right, maybe. NABRE, the one who knows all things before they exist still knows them after they are made. Interesting. NCB, all things were known to him before they were created, and they still are now that they are finished. NRSVA, before the universe was created, it was known to him, so it is since its completion. So in the work The Wisdom of Ben Sira by Patrick Shikan, he takes it as a statement of omniscience of all things in the future. And so there are scholarly takes that will read it that way, and it's easy to see why, is because the language seems to fit that type of reading. But does the context fit that? It's a different question. The context is that God knows what men do in secret places. Perhaps the thrust of the passage is that God knows the hearts of individuals and knows even what they will do before they do it. Using the CEB and NABRE, let's go look at the CEB again. It says, before all things were created, God knew them, so well as after they were finished. So before things come to pass, God knows what's going to happen. How? What's the mechanism? God sees into the hearts. God sees what people are going to do. And there is support for this idea later as well within Ben Sira, that this is God's mechanism for knowing what will occur based on what? God's knowing of people's hearts, God's knowing of how people act, God's knowing of his own doings, God bringing about his plans, right? Does this have to be some sort of universal? God knows all things, all propositions, truth values of all propositions before they occur, or God knows all things as they're occurring, which are coming to be created, right? Different concepts. Which concept is it? I note within my unpublished work that the same phrase occurs in Ben Sira 1:4, where wisdom was created before all things, and prudent understanding from eternity. It's interesting that wisdom was created before all things is not talking about a place in time, but relevant to everything. Like this had first and foremost within creation. For this verse, Sirach 1:4, we do actually have the Hebrew version, and so we could see what Greek phrase was translated out of what Hebrew phrase. And so that Hebrew phrase is way different for this being created before all things. It says, but exceeding the scope of these is wisdom, and truth is broader still. So exceeding the scope of these has been translated in Ben Sira as before all things. Interesting. So before is not this moment of time, but a value judgment. This is greater than everything else. So, of course, this is in the context of the entire book. The entire book has God watching the world. 17:15-20, 15:19, 18:14, 21:5, 34:6, and several other passages. It's just a reoccurring theme. And so the idea is that God is watching, and God is judging, and God's processing, and God is acting. It might not fit the entire context to have a random verse in there about God knowing all propositional truths from time eternity, especially with God real-time processing everything, especially in the context of man having volition to change things and do things and act rightly and to turn towards God, and God will respond in kind. It just doesn't make sense. So for now, I'm going to think that the better translation would be the NABRE, the one who knows all things before they exist, still knows them after they are made. So God knows what's coming up in the future based on what? His active observance of the world. That's the mechanism that's explained in context. Look at 34:16. The eyes of the Lord are upon those who love him. Again, reoccurring theme, God watches the world. So look at verse 35:6. The offerings of a righteous man anoints the altar, and its pleasing odor rises before the Most High. This is what I'm talking about, that this is an ancient conception of who Yahweh is. The idea is that our sacrifices, the burned odors, reach God, God smells them, and becomes pleased. We see this throughout the Bible, most notably after the ark settles. It's Noah, he comes out, he sacrifices, this pleasing aroma reaches God and causes God to rethink this whole destruction situation and give more lenience for man. The odors of our sacrifices are enjoyed, are pleasing to God. It says its pleasing odor rises before the Most High. God, in some sense, consumes those offerings. Notice very particularly that this is about the righteous man. Again, the text over and over again talks about how God will respond to the righteous. He will respond timely to the righteous. If someone's unrighteous, God's not going to respond to those people. But if you have the righteous heart, you're praying to God, God will respond to that. God will listen to your prayer, consider your prayer, and then act on your prayer. So turning to chapter 39, you got some very parallel statements for other proverbs. All the works of all the flesh are before him. Again, he's watching the world. And nothing can be hid from his eyes. Again, another eyes theme. From everlasting to everlasting, he beholds them. So I don't think this is a timeless statement. I don't think it's saying like he's looking at all history in the timeline. It's just saying that he's always watching the world, always has been, and always will. That appears to be what that is going for. No one can say, what is this? Why is that? For everything has been created for a use. Think back to the Proverbs. Proverbs 16:4, the Lord has made everything for its purpose, even the wicked for the day of trouble. The idea in context here is that good things and bad things are all the same things. They are bad things to the wicked and good things for the good. It says, to the holy, his ways are straight, just as they are obstacles to the wicked. You'll see this again and again described, in which the same rain he's made for the good people is going to be bad for the bad people. And so it's multi-use stuff, and how people get punished or rewarded is based on their own actions. So it's not a deterministic idea, but it is the idea that God is fulfilling some sort of role in history. He's bringing things to final destinations or our final plans, and he's planning it all out. He's making things happen. A very activist notion of what God is like and how God interacts with the world. Chapter 42, he searches out the abyss and the hearts of men and considers their crafty devices. God is searching, God is testing man's hearts. For the Most High knows all that may be known, and he looks into the signs of the ages. So God is figuring out what's going on, and then he's able to predict from that what's coming to pass. He declares what has been and what is to be. He reveals the tracks of hidden things. And so it looks like there's some sort of arrow or trajectory of history that God is putting on its course and bringing things to their ends. He's able to suss these things out and determine which way the arrow of history is going to be pointing. No thought escapes him, and not one word is hidden from him. He has ordained the splendor of his wisdom, and he is from everlasting to everlasting. Nothing can be added or taken away. He needs no one to be his counselor. Look at this description of how God operates. God is continually thinking. Discursive thoughts. He's considering the world. He's planning things out. It's very meticulous. God has plans. God will get those plans accomplished. God's able to look at history, see where things are going, see the trajectories of history, and being able to decide what those things are. It's a very activist notion of God. God is involved in the world in intricate ways. God is able to interact with history. Chapter 48:22, for Hezekiah did what was pleasing to the Lord, and he held strongly to the ways of David his father, which Isaiah the prophet commanded, who was great and faithful in his vision. In his days the sons went backwards, and he lengthened the life of the king. So God lengthened Hezekiah's life. It's acknowledging that righteous people can have extended lives. Why? Because God is involved in history. By the spirit of might he saw the last things and comforted those who mourned in Zion. He revealed what was to occur to the end of time and the hidden things before they came to pass. Yeah, again, this is not, it doesn't look like it's Nostradamus predictions of the future. This is God's plan for history. God bringing things to their final conclusions. The apocalyptic text that we see throughout the Bible. That's what it seems to be referring to. So let's flip back to Sirach 15 real quick. It says, do not say, because of the Lord I left the right way. It says, don't blame God on man's decisions. God has nothing to do with it, for he will not do what he hates. Do not say, it was he who led me astray, for he has no need of a sinful man. The Lord hates all abominations, and they are not loved by those who fear him. It was he who created man in the beginning, and he left him in the power of his own inclination. Again, this entire book is about individual volition, free will. Man has the capacity to act good or evil. It's within him to make a decision for or against God. Man's volition, again and again. The whole book is about that. Do what's right, eschew what is evil, and be righteous. Righteous is a real thing in this book. There are people who are righteous. These are the people that God is going to answer their prayers, commune with them. There is a segment of the population known as righteous. I'm going to read that verse again. For effect, it was he, God, who created man in the beginning, and he, God, left him, man, in the power of his own inclination. Free will. People can do and choose for or against God. It's not the idea that we are imbued with some sort of evil flesh that forces us to be evil, anything like that. He has placed before you fire and water. Stretch out your hand for whichever you wish. Before a man are life and death, and whichever he chooses will be given to him. The idea of free will, volition. So we're going to cut there, but the entire book, it's a long read. There's a lot of verses and a lot of concepts. But overall, I think this is a fairly good piece of evidence for how early Israel thought about God, even though we do have the Greek translations, which skews some Hebrew concepts. We got some of the Hebrew texts as well. But even though there are some Greek impositions in the Alexandrian translation that we should take with a grain of salt, even though we have that, it represents an earlier picture of God, one we find within the Bible. God is in heaven. God listens to prayers. God smells. It's not like the idols who have eyes and can't see, and ears and who can't hear, and noses and can't smell. And opposite to that, Yahweh in the Bible has all these things and can do all those things. That's their conception. Our prayers go to God. God hears our prayers, responds to our prayers. You can move God by emotions. God's emotions feature fairly prominent in this book. God's emotions can be pricked. God could be angered. God could be saddened. God could take righteous vengeance. The tears of the widow can sway him more heavily than someone just praying in a stoic fashion. This is their conception of God. And most of all, God actively watches the world. He gets involved in the details of this world. God is sovereign over this world and brings things to their conclusion. Of course, sovereignty over the world doesn't mean that man has no volition or free will. Man does. The text says he does. It says that God gave him command and dominion over the animals, all those things. But God, of course, is the sovereign over all things, even though man is delegated powers, responsibilities, and volitions under that sovereignty, that man is punished for the things man does wrong. Man has the flexibility to do those things, but there are consequences to our actions. Anyways, it's a very interesting book. I suggest people read through it if you want to see kind of early data point in the history of the development of God. Or if you're Catholic and you think it's inspired scriptures, that would be interesting too. But I don't know. Any questions or comments, put that down below or start a thread on the God is Open Facebook group. Thank you for listening.